Hello. So, good evening and welcome to the opening event for NMU's 2024 Gender Fair. My name is Paige Meisel and I am one of 3 student co-coordinators for this year's fair. My other co-coordinators are Mooney Van Orstel and Sydney Romps. We are happy that you are joining us tonight in person or via our live stream, and we hope that you will stop by the Gender Fair tomorrow. NMU's Gender Fair was founded in 2017 by Gender and Sexuality Studies minor Madeline Wilds, and it has been run every year since, with the exception of 2020, by students and co-coordinators and volunteers. And Gender Fair hosts and organizations, academic programs, and student projects from NMU and the larger Marquette community, with the goal of connecting people and resources and groups that may not have otherwise known about each other. Students, faculty, and staff, and community members create a space where conversations surrounding gender and sexuality, intersectionality, and diversity, among other topics. If you have been to the fair before, tomorrow is your chance to check it out. And if you have been, please come by and say hi, grab a snack, and reconnect. The Gender Fair will be in the Northern Center ballrooms from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Before we turn to tonight's speaker, we are thrilled to announce the 2 winners of our 2nd annual Gender Fair essay contest. Anna and Elena, if you would please join us on stage. Yeah. Anna Becker's essay is titled Hidden Mourning and Sensitivity, addresses the tragedy of suicide among trans youth. Judges found Anna's essay to be powerful and spellbinding. Elena Slate's essay is titled The Dignity of Representation and explores the relationship between queer representation and the pressure placed on queer people to correct misunderstandings caused by misrepresentation. Judges wrote that Elena's essay is extremely well written and addresses the prompt beautifully. Congratulations. Here we go.
Hello, my name is Mooney Van Orstel, and I am here to introduce our guest speaker. Tonight, we are honored to host Dr. Jesus Gregorio Smith as our opening keynote speaker. Dr. Smith's visit was generously sponsored by the Gender and Sexuality Studies program, the President's Committee on Gender and Sexuality, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, NMU Educator Preparation, the Center for Native American Studies, the English Department, the History Department, the Philosophy Department, and the Sociology Department. Thank you all for your generous support. Dr. Smith is a scholar studying the intersections of systematic racism, masculinity, and sexuality. He is an associate professor and chair of ethnic studies program at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. And he is an Associated Colleges of the Midwest, Andrew W. Mellon Fellow. Dr. Smith has published research in various journals, including Archives of Sexual Behavior, AIDS and Behavior, and Issues in Race and Society. He co-edited a collection of essays titled Home and Community for Queer Men of Color, The Intersection of Race and Sexuality. And in addition to his academic work, Dr. Smith has published op-ed pieces and public sociological essays in a variety of venues, such as Racism Review, Black Perspectives, and Latinx Talk. His research and expertise is highly regarded and sought after for public and academic talks and in popular media presses, including The Washington Post and Rolling Stone magazine. His current book project discusses sexual racism and online resistance, which he will be discussing tonight in a talk titled Fat, Femme, and Fabulous: How Body Size, Gender, and Race Influence Sexual Negotiations in an Online Dating Market. We will be hosting a Q&A at the end of his speech, so please, if you have a question, hold it till the end and wait until you are presented the mic to ask the question so that our live stream viewers and our interpreters can hear you. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Smith.
All right, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and so honored. This is amazing to be kind of the inaugural speaker for the Gender Fair, so very much appreciative of everyone who thought to bring me out, to the committee, and everyone who collaborated on this event. I am, again, talking about something that I write on, basically the intersections of bodies and race and sexuality. And because this is, for lack of a better word, a sexy conversation, I do want to have an early kind of trigger warning. There's going to be language that you're going to see that might feel very archaic, very troubling, especially if it's language that's coming from profiles of users that sometimes describe other folks in very problematic ways. But nonetheless, I think it's important for us to see things as they are online as we talk about sex and sexuality in very direct forms. All right, so let me just get set up here for a second. So, Fat, Femme, and Fabulous is what I thought about titling this, because I was very much interested not just in the things that were marginalizing people of color in their dating lives, but also the ways that people of color use fabulousness, or fat men use fabulousness, or femme men use fabulousness as a way to protect themselves and to resist. So I was very much interested in the idea of fabulosity as well. But in all of this, I kept thinking about how these intersections are so powerful and how they play out in the dating lives of so many people, and what that kind of tells us about race, about gender, and about sexuality off these mobile apps and offline. So this is basically what led me to this kind of work in the book project as it is. I want to give you kind of an overview of what I'm going to do for this project so you get a sense, and as was mentioned, you'll have a chance to ask questions at the end. I mark the slides as well. If there's a certain number that you want me to turn to or anything like that, you can just tell me and I'll go back to it for sure. Currently, I want to set the picture for us. What's the current issue at hand, to bring you there so you get a sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about this issue, and so you can understand its importance outside of just queer men. I'll also help you, that will help you understand exactly why I come up with the research questions that I do, and how and why I explore them like I do. This will also help you understand the sort of contributions that I'm making, both theoretically, demographically, to the literature, the kind of gaps that I'm attempting to contribute to. I'll then explain the data and methods that I utilize. This is a mixed methods project. I'm focusing largely on the qualitative content analysis for today's discussion, but I do run statistical analysis and other parts that I can speak to. Then I'll present to you the findings. So basically, what are some early findings that I've been seeing across my work? This will give you kind of a snapshot of what I've been thinking about and how I've been engaging my findings. And I'll summarize those for you towards the end. So let's get into the current issue at hand. In the fall of 2015, The Advocate, a popular American LGBT interest magazine, ran a series of stories called 6 in 10 Men, aimed at highlighting the HIV infection rate impacting the gay community presently. The stories brought to the forefront how, despite enhanced medication and improved community outreach, HIV infections are getting worse in the US for Black and Latino men. Indeed, on February 23rd of 2016, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, announced in a first-of-a-kind study that estimated lifetime HIV risk based on race that half of gay and bisexual Black men and a quarter of gay and bisexual Hispanic men will be diagnosed with HIV in their lifetimes. So this is after the onset of Truvada, or basically a pill that protects against HIV and AIDS, which was established and given to the public in 2014. So despite that access, they're still predicting higher rates in for different communities, different marginalized communities. And many of the explanations given for these rates of infection for both Latino and Black communities include poverty, stigma, barriers to healthcare access, and too few people knowing their status, all contributing in different ways to the epidemic. Therefore, the CDC report and explanation only gave further credence to the Advocate series. The most controversial piece from the series of stories was an article titled, Is Gay Dating Racism Creating an HIV Crisis? In it, the author argued that even though black men use condoms at the same rate or more often than white men, black men are less desirable and thus have a smaller pool of potential partners. Consequently, any case of HIV in the small dating pool for gay black men dramatically increases the likelihood of infection. Hence, the author points out how gay dating racism, often seen on profiles as, quote, no fats, no femmes, no blacks, may in fact be contributing to the HIV crisis. So that's kind of giving you a backdrop and where I was coming from and how I was kind of understanding this issue. Seeing profiles that were constantly showing that tagline or no fats, no femmes. It would be no blacks or no Asians, depending on your location. It was very, very interesting to see those three things tied together so often. And even if it wasn't publicly on profiles, people might say that to you on the dating apps. And so that was striking to me. Like, what was it about these three things, body type, race, and gender performance, that always had them tied together and was a way to marginalize or push out what's unattractive and define what is? I also thought how, considering that article from The Advocate, what's left out of the conversation. So much was left out, including how certain social locations may increase the chance of HIV risk. One such location is where men who have sex with men and other queer men often meet each other, which is online within geosocial mobile apps like Grindr. While most queer men prefer to seek partners via the internet, not only that, odds of contracting sexual infections are increased by online use, according to Barry Ford. Boulding and Associates found a link between men's risky sexual behavior and internet usage to find sexual partners. To further complicate this, Klein, in his 2010 study, found that the most sought-after profiles for men who specifically seek unprotected sex partners by means of the internet or social apps are the profiles of men of color. So those were typically going to be the most sought after for risky behavior. So again, this is striking to me what is happening here, or what is taking place in these erotic environments that's kind of playing into these ideas of who's desirable for what kinds of sex and in what kinds of ways. Also left out of the discussion is how marginalization in the online gay community based on body type, no fats, gender performance, no femmes, and race, no blacks or no Asians, depending on your location, together can limit the ability for certain queer men to negotiate sexual behaviors. For instance, an increase in BMI, this is a troubling kind of measure, is associated with lowered likelihood of rejecting sexual partners and decreased condom use, according to Maskowitz and Seal. Fields et al. Find that perceptions of masculinity is the primary contextual factor influencing partner selection, risk assessment, and decision-making regarding condom use for young black men. That is, those who are perceived as more masculine then have the power to make more negotiations. Likewise, the, quote, sexual networks of black men who have sex with men is so stifled by a legacy of racism in the US that it forces black men to be more highly interconnected than other groups, with the potential consequence of more rapid spread of HIV and a higher sustained prevalence of infection, end quote. Again, supporting the original Advocate article on gay dating racism in the 6 and 10 series. Taken together, these three marginalizations, what I was so interested in the social context of the internet and mobile apps, create pathways to increased HIV risk, STI risk, and possible infection. Despite the importance of investigating this phenomenon, very little work has examined the co-constitutive effects of body type, sex position, and race on sexual risk communication online. Oftentimes, sex position, again, being something associated with gender. Those that have explored the phenomenon have been more qualitative in nature or have had smaller sample size. This project intervened by doing a mixed methods approach and by examining these three certain areas in an intersectional fashion. For this talk, I developed 4 particular research questions that are guiding this work. One, how is desire constructed online? Obviously, for using that sort of language, the no fats, no femmes, no blacks, then it's really about, again, kind of marking and demarcating what is desirable and not. So I wanted to know how in these spaces desire is being constructed. Then, how is this hierarchy maintained? It's one thing to construct it, and another way, what are the processes that maintain this hierarchy of desirability? How does the hierarchy impact queer men? So again, it's one thing to have this hierarchy be established, but what's its influence on the sexual negotiations of queer men? And in what ways do these men resist the hierarchy of desire? So those are the main 4 questions that I'm looking at for this presentation today. And I believe my argument makes small but meaningful theoretical and demographic contributions to the fields of race, sexuality, health communication, and sexual risk behaviors. Theoretically, my work utilizes and builds upon Black feminist scholars Sophia Umoja Noble's Algorithms of Oppression and Ruma Benjamin's Race After Technology. For Noble, the power of algorithms in the age of neoliberalism and the ways those digital decisions reinforce oppressive social relationships and enact new modes of racial profiling, which she has termed technological redlining. By making visible the ways that capital, race, and gender are factors in creating unequal conditions. She brings to light various forms of technological redlining that are on the rise. Typically, the practice of redlining has been most often used in real estate and banking circles, and creating and deepening inequalities by race, such that, for example, people of color are more likely to pay higher interest rates or premiums just because they are Black or Latino, especially if they live in low-income neighborhoods. On the internet and our everyday lives, and our everyday uses of technology, discrimination is also embedded in computer code and, increasingly, in artificial intelligent technologies that we are reliant on by choice or not. I argue that this technological redlining takes place on atomforatom.com, the site that I explore. This reveals a queered Jim code. So Noble developed this term, the new Jim code, to talk about this technological redlining that we see online. And I'm kind of queering it in my work by exploring how you see that sort of relationship take place for queer communities or amongst queer men. With emerging technologies, we might assume that racial bias will be more scientifically rooted out. Yet, rather than challenging or overcoming the cycles of inequality, technological fixes too often reinforce and even deepen the status quo. For example, a study by a team of computer scientists at Princeton examined whether a popular algorithm trained on human writing online would exhibit the same bias tendencies that psychologists have documented among humans. They found that the algorithm associated white-sounding names with quote-unquote pleasant words and Black-sounding names with unpleasant ones. Such findings demonstrate what Benjamin calls the new Jim Code, the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequalities and that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of the previous era. So that's theoretically how I'm kind of engaging this work. Demographically, I'm also using a large sample size. So we data scraped for my research. So basically exploring all the profiles in a certain period of time online. It was about over 500,000 profiles. Very, very large samples to make projections on. The internet's role in social spaces for sexual negotiation, and a nationally represented sample. So again, my website, as I'll kind of explain, the website Explorer is very nationally representative. Method-wise, this is a purposeful qualitative sample thematic analysis that I'm presenting for you all, but it also introduces some quantitative analysis. So let's kind of get into the environment for a second. I'm gonna put this away. So the online environment, just to give us a sense of what this kind of looks like. This is an old tweet. It says, from a common gay boy, equality, scream the white gays with legalized gay across their shirts, and no blacks, no Asians, no femmes across their Grindr profiles. So again, this is giving us a context where you are going to see and become very understood in this way, the ways that people articulate their desires and how that basically in an online space, how this becomes very much acceptable. In essence, if we're looking for partners, or we're looking for dates, or we're looking for sexual partners in particular ways, the idea is very much that people can be as open as we want, and we can express ourselves as we feel is necessary. So this language doesn't necessarily get problematized, but when we think about what it's saying in essence and how much there's such a contrast between the demands of equality and then the practice of inequality, how that kind of contrasts with some of the messages that we have, especially as this language becomes very blunt on profiles. Let me give you more examples. For this profile, it says, looking for 18 to 39. Guys, if you message me first, then send a face pic first. I am a top. I'm not into blacks, Asian, stocky, chubby, femme, or guys old enough to be my dad. You can kind of see, again, this language, the expressions are very direct. You can also see how this kind of category takes place, and we see the establishment of how hierarchies are playing out online. And just one more for good measure. This says not into blacks, femmes, overweight, too skinny, or trans. So it's one thing to name all the things you don't like. In the contrast, it says, I like solid, I like muscular, fit, toned guys. So in this, you can see how language gets utilized as this comparison and this dichotomy between what is undesirable and what is desirable, and how that becomes raised and is personified through bodies, and how things like being too thin, too old, or being trans get associated in particular ways with what's undesirable. So to talk a little bit more about the data and methods that I utilize, web scraping is kind of what I look at. So theoretically, when you're engaging with web scraping, you're taking all the data that is from that website, in essence, and using it for academic purposes. The website that I use is adamforadam.com. It is a social site for men looking to find friends. This is how they describe themselves. Find friends, love, or sex with other men. It was once, at one point, the most popular dating site for queer men, or men who identified as men having sex with men. It also became a standout for a lot of other websites, so it paid for itself with pornographic media, allowing users to use it for free. That also then became the standard for other apps and other profiles, other social networking sites that would also use pornographic media as a way to pay for easier access and easier usage. Of course, that in another way became another way to have very explicit and very racialized and gendered messages. The profile data was collected, particularly I wanted to look at users in a very specific time period. So over a year in 2017 through 2018. And I wanted to make sure it was all those users, every user that was actually active that year. So that's what I did, using Python as a program to data scrape. There was a total of 530,000 profiles that were scraped from Adam for Adam. And they were scraped from every U.S. state and the District of Columbia. So again, this is a very massive amount of data for a queer men's dating site. That's also very expansive when it's comparing all these different locations. So just a quick kind of descriptor of these profiles. So I looked at sexual practices, which was defined at the time as those who are using condoms and those who don't. And for don't, it was anything goes was the choice that you could pick. It only provided those two options. And then this thing theoretically called the ideal body type, which oftentimes in the scientific literature and in everyday kind of terminology, people were describing very specific bodies in some ways, which I'll get into. And I use that as kind of factors. Race and ethnic background is white, black, Latino, Asian, and mixed. And then sex position as well, those who top, those who bottom, and those who participated in both. More so, just to kind of tell you what this data looked like, 40% of the gay men and the queer men who opted to have sex without a condom versus 59 of the men who at least communicated with their profiles that they would prefer to use condoms. 59% of the user profiles did not. They really described themselves as having average body types, while other 41% described themselves as having an ideal body type. So the communication that they had within their profile suggested this. The vast majority of the users, 51% were white, 22% black, 13 Latino, and 45% being Asian, and 7% being of mixed race, typically white and black. The last 34% of profile users listed bottom positioning as their preferred sex position. That sex position is oftentimes, and I'll get into that in a bit, something that gets very gendered. So a lot of the men that I interviewed would talk about those who are perceived as more masculine would be the more assertive and top partner, and those who would be perceived as more feminine would be the bottom partners. So this is typically how they would actually talk about sexual positioning. 37% listed top as their preferred sex position, and 30% had no preference or listed themselves as versatile. So let's get into the results of my analyses again. So first, how is desire constructed online? So I found that desire is constructed in 3 specific ways. The very first image on the home page, which would communicate who is wanted and desired on the website. So again, thinking of Noble's work on algorithms of the oppressed, and how necessarily what's being established on these websites can reinforce systems of oppression. Second, how users are forced to racially identify, engage with websites socially. So thinking of technological redlining, thinking about that new Jim Code, if you are forced by a website to identify in particular ways, this is how structurally you are reinforcing that segregation. So that was playing out oftentimes with the website. And then how users communicated their desires via their profiles was oftentimes in congruence with a racial hierarchy of desire. So this hierarchy that what's most desirable is going to be one thing and what's least desirable is going to be another. So this was the very first image on the website. So we can see you got your slimmed person, muscular physique to a point. You got hair, which very much is going to signify signify masculinity in different ways, and presumably somebody who's clearly not going to be black, or clearly not going to be fat, or clearly not going to be Asian. So you're seeing some things that are very, very explicit in the very first image that's inviting users to the website. This is going to communicate something if this is what's going to be the first thing that people see, I would argue. Again, it's saying meet your Adam today. It's obviously free. It also has a phone version called Radar that people can use. Again, this is very similar, or definitely kind of the background for how Grindr would be utilized. When creators create their profiles, again, this is free. You just have to have an email to go with it. And with that, these are kind of the things that you're kind of forced to respond to: your age, your height, your weight. There's a drop-down line for that. This website is so powerful in the sense that you can look at particular locations within the US and globally. You can get down to specific areas of a city if you wanted to. The requirement is to have a headline, a profile. You can have a profile picture. The research suggests that if you fill out your profile more, you're able to get hits more often. So users were wise often, if they're wanting more hits or not. But this also allows people who are not necessarily out or who are just kind of messing around for a moment to create a profile for a second that's free and then get off if they want. And then this sends an email. So these are all the ways that users can utilize the profile, and this is also how they can communicate in that profile space to communicate with other users their wants and their desires, as well as their sexual health. Again, a second thing to consider is the way that users were forced to identify. I'm thinking here, again, speaking to algorithms of the oppressed, when your algorithms is established a certain way and when you're forced to identify a certain way. So you are given a drop-down box for age, for height, for weight, for waist size, for body type, for skin, hair color, body hair, if your what your race and ethnicity is, all these requirements in order to create your profile. So, and of course, the more that you fill out, the better in terms of getting hits. And how users are forced to racially identify and engage the website typically socially organizes them into a hierarchy of desire. Let me elaborate on this. So this is how a profile, when it's complete, would look. You'll have your age, your height, your weight, your waist size, all these things that become versions of erotic capital, or the attributes that we have that elicit an erotic response in others. And so the more that you fill out, the better. But also I'm just paying attention to exactly what's getting utilized here. You can write whether you're out or not, that part, being out or not, whether you smoke or not, whether you drink or not, or whether you do drugs. That portion was actually optional. The first part is the part that you're forced to respond to. But then it gets even more explicit. You can then say your penis size, whether you're cut or not, whether you are, what your sexual positioning is, and obviously here, whether you participate in safe sex or not. At this time, it's not very clear on what the safe sex means. Also, your HIV status, and a kicker too is where you would like to meet. Is it my place? Is it your place? Are we meeting publicly? There's also things that I thought indicated in some ways class status, right? If somebody can host someone versus if you have to meet elsewhere. You could block off your picture, or you could reveal your picture. This becomes a negotiation with users. You could send your profile to folks. You could block people. This becomes a really, really popular resource. In fact, previous research that examined different dating sites found that what made Adam for Adam, this website, particularly so interesting and so useful to so many users, is they had the ability to block folks in very stratified ways. So let's elaborate on this. Here's how we get really, really specific. Again, we could say we're in North America. We can say we're in Wisconsin. We can say what area of Wisconsin, right? And we can get very specific. We can look at age, height, weight. I want you to pay attention to, as well, where things are located in this Dropbox. So look at dick size, dick cut, ethnicity. The putting together of these three things was really interesting to me, and because you're not filling out your profile in this sort of order, so it was interesting where they were located and how they're right by ethnicity and sex role and so forth. So these three things was very striking to me. Again, thinking about that new Jim code and how you get situated in particular ways. And then, as you can see to the side, you can search in particular cities, and you can search for members, and you can block. So the ability to put whether we were interested in people of color or not, whether we were interested in white folks or not, that was one of the largest reasons why people were drawn to this app and to this website versus others. And the third way was users communicating their desire via their profiles. And the way they did it oftentimes across profiles was in congruence with a hierarchy of desire. So let me give you an example. This profile user says, I'm into younger, college age guys that are masculine, athletic, and fit. Oftentimes when there was a request, it was going to be some sort of arrangement like this. Young, it's going to be masculine, it's going to be athletic, it's going to be fit. Large indicators. This other user said, I am muscular, masculine, HIV negative, attractive. The other thing I found very interesting was this adjacent language that gets used. I play most sports and enjoy vacations in Europe and the Caribbean. I think this communicates two things. One, that I'm active and physically fit. If I'm masculine if I'm playing sports, and then I have a class status with my ability to travel. Next, how is the hierarchy of desire maintained online. So if we're seeing, again, the no fats, no femmes, no blacks establishment, which suggests that whiteness and thinness and muscularness and masculinity is most desired, how does it get maintained? So I think it happens via the language of preference. So this is the use of sexual racism to reject partners and then masquerading that rejection as personal choice, or using adjacent language to communicate the same sort of rejection. So maybe we're not going to be explicitly no fats, no femmes, no blacks. We might use other language that communicates our point for us. So let me give you some examples. So in using sexual racism or race-based rejection, race-based rejection of sexual partners, this profile states, I am, and I'm highlighting here, I am not into black men. Sorry, but my choice here becomes this neoliberal expression of a preference, right? And so by saying I'm sorry or sorry here, this kind of a protective agent, and becomes a linguistic maneuver that then kind of takes away, or is intended to take away, the blunt and piercing fact of, in essence, what many of the black men that I interviewed would state would be just a racist rejection. This essentializing of all black men as one thing. Another usage of adjacent language, as I mentioned before, was maybe as people become more open to not being comfortable with this type of language, people then started to embrace language that would do the work without being so blunt. So here's an example here. I wouldn't mind finding a workout partner. All sports, cars, working out, playing ball, a lot of working out, a lot of sports. Oftentimes that can communicate things without even having to say no fats, no femmes. Then I was very curious too, how can we understand how this hierarchy, this constant reinforcement of what is desirable and what is undesirable, its impact on queer men. And this is what I found. That by filtering fat men out of sight and leaving them lonely, and by gendering the requests for raw sex or condomless sex, and by using race as kind of this mechanism, or as a boundary for risk or avenue for risky behavior. So let's kind of see what that looks like. In this case, filtering fat men out of sight and leaving them lonely. This person states, this 18-year-old Latino states, I'm a big guy, and some like that. Others don't. Everyone to themselves. If I do, however, contact you, just say not interested, and I'll back off. What I found commonly was fat men describing how they're basically invisible in certain spaces, how people won't give them attention, won't engage, won't even speak to them, or will block their profiles and things of that nature. This is why I found loneliness to pop up often, and I thought this profile from this 33-year-old was really interesting, because all it said in its space where it can communicate with users its wants and desires was, I'm just a lonely guy. So loneliness in various forms is popping out or becoming thematic, especially for large men. I also found it fascinating how much gendering was taking place when it came for requesting certain behaviors. In this sense, the idea of engaging in condomless or riskier sex in some instances was very much a gendering thing. In this profile, this person states, I love being a man, and I love men and masculinity. I prefer men who are masculine, hairy, in shape, hung. I love a nice big pair of low-hanging nuts. Hey, I said it was going to be an interesting conversation, y'all. Okay. And if you drop down, he says, not into humiliation or degradation, just not man sex, not into sissy boys, trannies, fatties, or partying. That's another way of saying having sex with particular drugs. It's just not my thing. So it's very, very fascinating to see this sort of perspective where the request for particular sex acts, in this case, condomless sex, is very much a gendered thing. This goes back to kind of the earlier, or it made me think of the intersection with earlier studies that looked at the profiles that were most sought after for risky sex being profiles of men of color, and how being a man of color can oftentimes be associated with different types of gendering, whether you're Asian and associated with more feminine performances, or Black and Latino and being associated with hypermasculinity. The third way I saw this playing out was, again, using race. Race is a form of technology here. So this profile user says that he served in the Navy for 10 years, again, signifying something. He's preferring people who 24 through 42 that are white or Latin, so establishing his preferences. He's not sexually attracted to blacks or Asians. There's that sorry again, it's doing the work for us. And what's interesting here is this person was willing to have safe sex for guys that do play safe, and in his profile filled out every aspect, everything on his profile to increase hits, but leaves out sex practice. So this, I think, is an interesting way to think of how people negotiate things. So sometimes it can be stigmatizing to have a preference or to openly express a desire for particular sex acts, especially in the queer community where HIV and AIDS was a very stigmatizing thing and harmful thing for a good period of time. So early on in 2017 and 2018, this push or willingness to talk about your sexual preferences could be very stigmatizing. So this person who perhaps isn't wanting to put isn't wanting to say anything goes. He says anything goes. I'm sorry. What I meant to say is this person, you could have profiles in which they were not putting anything goes, and they're trying to communicate to folks that this is the way that we can have sex that's condomless. I just am not going to say it to avoid being stigmatized. This person uses race, again, as a technology and as an avenue for risky pleasure. So, again, this person has nothing down for condom use and states, masculine but totally submissive white, pussy boy bottom. If we jump down, even forced femme, humiliation, smooth, bubble butt, tight, clean hole, black, Latino, hot, and groups, anon scene, role play. So here again is a profile that's not going to communicate openly their desires. But then when they're engaging in particular risky sex, this is, a lot of group sex, anon scenes, the particular request is going to be for Black and Latino profiles. Again, that is going to reaffirm previous literature that suggested that the profiles that are most sought after for this type of sex are going to be men of color. That obviously connects to a long history of hypersexuality that's been placed on men of color, especially Black and Latino men, as riskier and more aggressive partners. And so that whole stereotype is going to be desirable if you're looking to engage in riskier acts. For my last question, it was, in what ways do these men resist the hierarchy of desire? So again, thinking about that fabulosity, thinking about how, okay, it's one thing if we're lonely and we're being exposed to racism and fat phobia and femphobia and all these different things, but what do the men do? I really believing that they're not just passive agents on these websites, but they're also resisting in various ways. So I argue that they resist in three specific ways: emphasizing humanity despite being devalued. So seeing or articulating in various ways in their profiles how they're more than just what they were being reduced to. Resisting white supremacy. So even if the most desired men across the board, and typically in a lot of research indicates that white men being the most desired in these spaces, the men of color who actively would kind of resist that and request men of color instead. And then lastly, describing their bodies in desirable fashions, even if they're being openly rejected in other ways. So let's take a look at some of this. So an example here, this older Black man states, not looking for physical perfection because I can't offer that, but I can offer adult behavior, intelligent conversations, good company, loyalty, intimacy. factors can be related to his age, also the sort of rejection he's probably getting because of his age and his race. But then he also emphasizes that sex and desirability and connection is far beyond just the physicality and far beyond the things that we can reduce. Speaking to, how he can, in essence, be so much more than the things he gets reduced to. For this user, the request, again, the kind of active rejection when one thing is constantly kind of being reinforced through the website, through people's profiles of what's desirable, then they push to desire something opposite of that becomes a radical act in and of itself. This person says, I love Latino guys, blacks, Asians, etc., but all racial groups are welcome to play. So even the decision to not reject, to not play into that, and to say everyone is kind of welcome, and to use language like I love this, but that language doesn't go in a negative route of rejection. And for a lot of men, their fabulosity was displayed in the ways that they accepted their bodies or engaged their bodies in different ways. So this person says, far from skinny, but thick and sexy. Nice guy with a great head on my shoulders, nice smile, great heart, credible cook. And this other person says, far from being the worst looking and dropping down, I'm no super skinny and really built brother, but I carry my weight well. So this is interesting, right? So here are folks who are saying, I'm far from skinny, but I'm thick and sexy. So a reclaiming of a body that's oftentimes rejected in these spaces and that's often made to feel lonely. But even in the situations where there is a reclaiming or a desirable or a push of agency in these moments, we can still see how fat phobia plays out by separating the good fat from the bad in this instance. So I'm no super skinny or really built brother, but I carry my weight well, can work as this way to establish I'm a good fat person because I carry my weight well versus others who might look sloppy with their fats. So despite having some progressive moments of describing bodies in desirable fashions, you could still see the reinforcement of different sorts of hierarchies and different sorts of oppressions. So just to give you a quick rundown of what I talked about, I know I talked about a lot in this moment, but I want to summarize some of the stuff that I found in the questions. So I asked, how is desire constructed online? We saw with those tweets and we saw with those Grindr profiles, and we see with the way that people talk on Adam for Adam, that the infrastructure of the website from the front page, the way users are forced to identify, reflects the biases of the website creators, reinforcing bias. Users then communicate within their profiles their preferences, oftentimes mimicking the racial hierarchy of desire. And how is that hierarchy maintained? The language of preference or choice naturalizes sexual racism online, disguising the social construction of desire and justifying the hierarchy. Third, how does the hierarchy impact queer men? So it worked by filtering out fat, large bodies and leaving them lonely, by gendering sexual practices, in particular raw sex, and by using race as a boundary to risk and an avenue for pleasure. And in what ways do the men resist this hierarchy? The men often emphasize their humanity to counter the marginalization they faced. They resisted white supremacy by actively requesting men of color, or despite not fitting the ideal type, the men describe themselves in desirable ways. All right, and that's all I have for you. Thank you. And here is my email in case you need to ask me questions. All right, I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes. So if anybody has questions, I'll run a mic over to you. Just please wait to ask your question until I have it in your hands, just so everybody electronically can hear you.
Check. Oh, there's. I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail on why you chose Adam for like your basis.
Yes, so that's a great question. When I started this work, this actually started in 2012. Adam for Adam was the most popular site at the time. It was actually the most popular and the most utilized up until like 2019, 2020. It also is the site that had more men of color versus some other sites. So Grindr tends to still and tends to be younger and whiter, whereas other sites tended to embrace men of color, and Adam for Adam was one of those. It was also one of the few sites that wasn't selling personal data at the time compared to some other sites. So there was a lot of factors that I thought were really helpful with this website. Also, it's free use. I think that's not only the way that you can use it for free, but what you could do with it for free. So other websites and social networking apps eventually did embrace a more liberated model, but the problem was what you can do on that model was shrunk. So sometimes, like on Grindr, it might allow you to stratify your search by age and I think body type, but it won't do it by race, or it won't do it by more factors that Adam for Adam does, for instance. And again, that previous research and previous users were describing their desire. The reason why they liked Adam for Adam compared to others is they were able to stratify specifically how they wanted and specifically in racialized sorts of ways. So that was really important to me, or very interesting to me, about what mechanisms it allowed that you didn't have to pay for, what access people had and could do with it. As you could see how explicit the profiles could be and the type of searches you could have was really amazing. And then the huge sample size, I thought. So all of those kind of factors were leading me to do that work.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Super interesting. Do you have any sense of how the listing these preferences in the negative way that they're usually listed, so I don't want this, I don't want that, affects the matching or the success that a user has in the dating website? Does it increase, decrease? Does it actually filter people out? I mean, what kind of effect does it have for the person who's listing these negative preferences?
That's a great question. So there has been research that's been done that found that users actually viewed folks who did express their preferences in these negative ways as less desirable. Interestingly enough, right? So that's again where I started to notice the change in the language. So now it's where we might use adjacent language to communicate the same sort of thing, but in a much more socially acceptable way. Right, so the adjacent language is, I play sports, I do this, I drive my sports vehicles, and I work out all the time, blah, 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 blah. All that is going to do the work for me without me having to go the negative route. And granted, I do want to emphasize, when it comes to sex and sexuality, when it comes to sexual practice, preference is a real thing, I think, obviously, that intimacy, I'm not trying to claim that, we don't have our preferences, but what I want us to think about is how often these our preferences are influenced by the larger social structure. So here, even when you're creating an app and the first image you see is not someone who looks anything like you, and the porn that's playing on the sides that pays for that website is a lot of folks that don't look anything like you, it's going to reinforce what is desirable. And again, it's kind of shocking for so much variety with people that it all seemed to come down to the same sort of thing. We don't want fat people, we don't want particular folks of color, and we don't want femme across the board, despite the fact that this is supposed to be varied. Everybody's supposed to have various sorts of preferences. Everyone seemed to have the same thing. So I think this seems to speak to, again, the larger social structure in society and how that influences desire.
All right, I think we probably have time for one more if there's any more. I'm a little slow, but I'll get there.
So it's kind of more of a comment, honestly. I just thought it was really interesting, being a larger bodied person myself, how much humor people try to use, because it's almost like an apology for taking up space, and how, it was oh, I'm not a slim boy or whatever, with the laugh out loud and all of those things. And I don't know, I don't identify as a male, and I'm white as the day is long, but just a lot of that resonated, like the inability to like take up space and almost being like apologetic, or I'm very humorous, you know.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, you're so funny, and I'm like, well, I have to be. So
Yes,
but
yes.
yeah, I noticed that as well.
There's a work by Jason, I think his last name is Winsdell, called Fat Gay Men, and it talks about all these different factors in the construction of desire with fat bodies. And typically, fat men are punished in the queer community for having bodies that are understood or read as more effeminate. That having fatness feminizes you, and femininity is absolutely devalued in the queer spaces. Um, and so, yes, there's oftentimes this playing up the fat, funny sidekick to one, work as a counter to some of the marginalization you might face, and to increase your erotic capital through humor. But also, I think, it becomes this defensive measure and this protective measure, as you said, like what you have to do in order to survive some of these spaces.
There it is. I'm not sure what we have for time. Dr. H? Okay, perfect. Anybody? Okay. I'm getting my steps in, guys. We're doing it.
Excuse me, testing. Okay. Forgive me as I try to articulate my thoughts,
Yeah.
but understanding that a large pool of users probably take the criteria listed in each profile and just judge at a first glance based on their own preferences. How did you find during your research that, give me a second, all the criteria that users were forced to list and put under, did that make your research easier, harder, and what's your personal opinion on maybe if you would continue this research further into other dating sites, or any difficulties you might expect to find if you were to expand your search?
Okay, what was the first part of that question?
Sorry. Just your personal experience researching how all of these criteria made it easier or harder to bring your research to light.
Yeah, so I think that all the different criteria, or at least at the time, eventually Adam for Adam softened its stance and didn't force everybody to fill out certain things, but up to a certain point in time, you had to fill out all those crazy things about your height and your weight and your waist size and your skin color and all this stuff. And that made it easier, right? Because to me, it spoke to why qualitatively through interviews people were saying, well, this is why we're using this website in particular. Adam for Adam becomes useful because it's forcing this sorts of usage, and where other websites and other geosocial apps were allowing people to hide and stuff like that, or not put those factors, this one was making people. And so that became useful in the need to if you wanted to stratify by race or by body hair or location, things like that, that became useful. So that aspect, I think, was useful for my work, and it helped me speak to things a little better. And then when I went on to have interviews, I had interviews with 50 plus men who had multiple profiles in different apps. It also was something that I could speak to, kind of their process of having to identify. This was also interesting because when people did hack the search, some of the black men who were oftentimes being rejected for race would then use mixed as a way to increase usage. So they wouldn't have their picture up, put mixed instead of black, and they would have an increase of hits. So that the forced kind of usage in the beginning was something that people could then manipulate to their benefit if they needed to, or to increase hits in different ways. So I think it was it's like a fascinating aspect to this kind of process. Now, what was your second question?
If you were to expand your research in this area, what difficulties would you expect facing forward?
Okay, that's a great one. I think If I were to expand, I would love. I have a student right now that's looking at queer women, for instance, and I'm loving the comparison. It's working very differently a lot of ways. I think some of the research that's out there that's looking at straight folks and straight apps is really interesting because gaming happens a lot in straight spaces or in straight apps. So it's much more about how many matches you get and a lot less about the sort of kind of communication that happens on Adam for Adam and Grindr and a few other sites. So I think that's really interesting, and that would be difficult in some ways. I would have to think theoretically, what does gaming do, and how does gaming kind of influence it? And it's very much, a game. The sexual field is very much a game, and you knowing how to play it, right? If you're black and you put mixed, or if you're fat and you make yourself funny, if you know how to play the game, that's going to increase your chances of hits. So I can imagine that overlap in straight spaces and in queer women spaces as well. There is some work out there that's looking at trans misogyny, for instance, that's looking at, and you're seeing that a lot in these spaces now. Men who identify as heterosexual who are now on apps like Adam for Adam and Grindr, seeking out trans women and then being really homophobic in the rejection of everybody else, and then describing trans women as ideal women, so they put down hetero women. It's super fascinating what, with changes in our language and changes in our cultural landscape and changes in our technological reaches, what we're seeing and what we could continue to see. So I imagine that it's going to be helpful in a lot of ways and more revealing. In some ways, it'll be more difficult. Like I could web scrape with Adam for Adam, but it's not Grindr. Like I probably couldn't do that with Grindr. And I can imagine that being much more difficult with other apps right now that are probably cracking down on that resource. So I think that would be the problems, but I still think there's so much opportunity to explore different things in different avenues. Thank you. That was a great question. All right. Thank you all so much. This was incredible.
Thank you all so much for coming and for all the support that we've gotten from all the different departments. On your way out, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of feedback, we have QR codes on both of the exits, and I hope you all have a great night.